Hello, this is Dr. Rebecca Wood, and I would like to welcome you to the Week 8 lecture. This week we're going to think about what we have learned this term and also about the futures of humanity. We've had a microscopic taste of literature and history this term. We've studied the ideas of more than 2,000 years, but that's only skating over the surface of humanity's grand experiments and hard-won wisdom. So much more is unknown. Much of it because it was discovered before history began, before anything was written down for later generations, or lost after it was recorded. As we study those who have come before us, we should also think about what comes next. How can we use what we've learned throughout our lives to move humanity forward in a positive direction? And what would we even consider a positive direction? Our first author this week was a famous teacher from antiquity. Epictetus was born in approximately 55. That's it, just 55. He was a slave in the Roman Empire who was freed and subsequently banished from Rome in 93. He spent the rest of his life teaching students and living modestly in his native Greece. And his work was largely recorded by his students, especially a man named Arrian. Epictetus was an influential member of the Stoics who believed in finding contentment in whatever life one leads. They believed that the life we have is preordained and that if we are born poor, then that is our life, and if we are born into, let's say, a royal family, that is the life we are ordained to have. And the passage in our textbook illustrates this Stoic principle and Epictetus' viewpoint about fear of the future. He did not have a lot of respect for anyone who was really afraid of basically anything. He said, "The chief mark of mean spirit and of cowardice is not death, but rather the fear of death." And you've heard that idea probably in many other literary works throughout the years. As a former slave who was then kicked out of Rome and left to his own devices to survive, he was unsympathetic to those who feared losing their wealth. After all, he had spent much of his life not only having little wealth of his own, but being someone else's property. And then we have a chapter from the Holy Bible, the New Testament, in our textbook, and it's Luke chapter 16. This passage includes the well-known parable about a very wealthy man and a beggar named Lazarus. While the two men were alive, the rich man ignored Lazarus and let him lie at the gate full of sores and didn't want to help him. When they both died, though, Lazarus went to heaven and the rich man did not. And the rich man begged Lazarus to come down to hell with some cold water for him and drip it into his mouth. But Abraham, who was in heaven with Lazarus as kind of a supporter and a welcoming committee, refused to allow that, saying that the rich man was comforted already in life, while Lazarus suffered evil things in his life. Our next author is Thomas Malthus. He wrote an essay on the principle of population, which set forth ideas that we're still talking about and considering whether he was right or wrong. And he came from a wealthy intellectual family and became a pastor. And the principles of his essay influenced the British government to dramatically decrease government aid to the poor. And so he was a minister, and he was also an economist. And then, interestingly enough, his essay led to less government aid for the poor who were starving in many situations. And so he stated that population cannot be checked without producing misery or vice. And Charles Dickens created the character Ebenezer Scrooge, which some of you wrote about this term, who famously tells a solicitor that those who would rather die than go to a workhouse had better do it and decrease the surplus population, as a satire of Malthus's viewpoint. So Malthus not only influenced the government and scientists and economists up to this day, he also inspired one of the greatest literary works of the English language. Mohandas Gandhi is our next author this week. He was born in India in 1869, went to law school in England, and then began practicing law in South Africa. And between 1894 and 1914, he developed his famous philosophy of nonviolence resistance to South African policies that later became apartheid. And then he went back to India in 1914 and began working on the struggle for independence for India from Great Britain. And Gandhi wrote a speech that is included in our textbook about economic and moral progress. He stated that the test of orderliness in a country is not the number of millionaires it owns, but the absence of starvation in its masses. And in his speech, Gandhi, who was a Hindu, quoted from the Christian Bible, "Jesus answereth again and saith unto them, Children, how hard is it for them that trust in riches to enter into the kingdom of God? It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God." And one could maybe think about, well, who was Gandhi speaking to? He was not only speaking to his audience in India, but he was speaking to his audience in Great Britain, and also possibly to the audience including the entire world. Simone Weil, our final author this week, was born in Paris in 1909 to Jewish parents who were not religious, and she became a Christian in 1938. She lived through both World War II and World War I, and she died in England of tuberculosis during World War II because she subjected herself to near starvation. She refused to eat well to get herself into good health again due to deep sympathy toward her fellow French citizens who were suffering under Nazi occupation. And so essentially you could consider it that she gave up her life for the French resistance. However, since she was dead, she was no longer able to work for that cause. So that kind of gives us something to think about. And she wrote Equality, and she stated that by making money the sole, or almost the sole, motive of all actions, the sole, or almost the sole, measure of all things, the poison of inequality has been introduced everywhere. She wrote that balance and equality would mean honoring each human condition with those marks of respect which are proper to it and are not just a hollow pretense. So, building on our knowledge, how can we make the world a better place? What would that better place look like to you? And so we all have a job to do. We all have things that we need to do in our practical lives. But how can we make the world a better place? Maybe in some smaller way or possibly in a larger way. And so I want you to think about that a little bit. Obviously, we don't need to derail our entire lives, but just to think about that, how can we all make the world a better place and not a worse place? And this is our works cited list for this week because I've tried to model documentation this term. And please, as you go forward, remember that all of the papers here at SPS, the instructors will want nice documentation and information that is quoted in quote marks if necessary and integrated with your own thoughts. And your own thoughts are the most important parts of your papers and essentially everything you do. I've really enjoyed working with all of you this term, and I hope the best for you. Thank you. Bye-bye.